The question came at me sideways, delivered with that particular brand of passive aggression wrapped in synthetic sweetness that only a yoga instructor named Rainbow could perfect. I was standing in the marble foyer of my son's house, my arms full of organic groceries that cost more than most people spend on a week's worth of food, when she glided down the staircase like some ethereal being descended from Mount Enlightenment. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Mrs. Chen, she said, her voice dripping with manufactured concern, I've been teaching harmony for 6 months now, and I can't help but notice you never join our sessions. Don't you think your spiritual wellness deserves the same attention you give to everything else? I set the groceries down carefully on the Italian marble countertop, each movement deliberate while I processed what I'd just heard. Spiritual wellness. As if the woman who'd been funding her daughter-in-law's journey to inner peace for the past 3 years didn't understand the concept of spiritual wellness. As if the woman who'd been writing checks for meditation retreats, crystal healing workshops, and now private yoga sessions somehow lacked enlightenment. My name is Linda Chen, and at 68 years old, I've learned that silence can be the most powerful response to stupidity. So I said nothing to Rainbow as she stood there in my son's entryway, her perfectly toned body draped in designer athleisure that cost more than most people's monthly car payments. Instead, I began unpacking the groceries, each item a small fortune in organic perfection that Harmony had specifically requested. Himalayan pink salt. $75 for a container that would last 2 weeks. Grass-fed, hormone-free beef from cattle that apparently lived better lives than most humans. Artisanal honey harvested by bees who'd never known the indignity of commercial farming. Each purchase was another thread in the web of financial support I'd been weaving around my daughter-in-law for years, a web she seemed determined to take for granted. Rainbow lingered, clearly expecting some kind of response to her perfectly crafted insult disguised as spiritual guidance. When none came, she tried again. I just think it's so important for family members to support each other's growth journeys. Harmony has made such incredible progress since we started working together. Her chakras are finally aligned, and her aura has shifted from that muddy brown to a beautiful golden yellow. Auras, chakras, growth journeys. The vocabulary of someone who'd convinced my son's wife that enlightenment could be purchased by the hour at $250 per session. I continued unpacking groceries, my hands steady despite the rage building in my chest like a carefully banked fire. The truth was, I knew exactly why I never joined Harmony's yoga sessions. It wasn't because I lacked spiritual awareness or didn't value personal growth. It was because I was too busy paying for everyone else's enlightenment to have time for my own. But that truth was too complex, too layered with resentment and disappointment, to explain to someone whose deepest spiritual insight probably came from a motivational Instagram post. I'd been supporting Harmony's various quests for inner peace since she married my son David 5 years ago. It started small, as these things always do. A weekend meditation workshop here, a weekend retreat there. David would mention it in passing during our Sunday dinners, how Harmony had found this amazing teacher or discovered this life-changing practice. And I, wanting to be supportive, wanting to help my new daughter-in-law find her place in our family, would quietly transfer money to their account to cover the costs. It was never presented as a request. David was too proud for that, and Harmony too clever. Instead, it came as updates, casual mentions of financial strain, subtle hints about missed opportunities for growth because of monetary constraints, and I, feeling guilty for having more than enough while they struggled with student loans and a starter marriage income, would step in. The meditation workshops led to longer retreats. The weekend getaways became week-long spiritual journeys. The local teachers weren't enough. Harmony needed to study with masters, gurus, certified practitioners who charged premium prices for their wisdom. Each new level of enlightenment required a higher financial investment, and somehow I had become the silent investor in my daughter-in-law's spiritual portfolio. Rainbow was still talking, her voice floating around the kitchen like incense smoke, meaningless and cloying, something about energy blocks and the importance of intergenerational healing. I tuned her out and focused on the groceries, finding a strange meditation in the simple act of organizing food that cost more than many families spent on rent. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was being lectured about spiritual wellness by someone I was essentially employing while I unpacked groceries I'd purchased for a woman who saw me as nothing more than a convenient ATM with maternal obligations. But I said nothing. I'd learned years ago that pointing out hypocrisy to people invested in their own righteousness was a waste of breath. Instead, I filed Rainbow's comment away with all the other small cruelties I'd endured in the name of family harmony. The subtle digs about my traditional values, the rolled eyes when I mentioned practical concerns, the way Harmony would introduce me to her spiritual friends as David's mother, rather than by name, as if I were an appendage rather than a person. The grocery unpacking complete, I turned to face Rainbow directly, for the first time since her enlightened observation about my spiritual deficiencies. She was younger than I'd initially thought, probably in her early 30s, with the kind of effortless beauty that comes from never worrying about money, never having worked a real job, never having to choose between her own needs and someone else's. "You know," I said, my voice carefully neutral, "I think you're absolutely right about spiritual wellness being important. I've been thinking about that quite a bit lately." Her face lit up with the satisfied glow of someone who believed she had just performed a successful intervention. "I'm so glad to hear that. I have some wonderful recommendations for beginner classes, and I know Harmony would love to share this journey with you." Beginner classes. As if I hadn't been exploring spiritual practices since before this woman was born. As if the 68 years I'd lived, the challenges I'd overcome, the wisdom I'd accumulated through actual experience, somehow counted for nothing compared to her certification in therapeutic yoga. I smiled, the expression feeling strange on my face after weeks of careful neutrality. "Actually, I was thinking about something a bit different, something that might help me understand why I feel so resistant to joining these sessions." She leaned forward eagerly, probably imagining herself as the enlightened teacher about to guide another lost soul towards the light.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Resistance is just fear, you know? Fear of change, fear of growth, fear of facing what's been buried in our subconscious. Exactly, I agreed. Which is why I've decided to do some investigating. Some deep spiritual archaeology, you might say. The front door opened before Rainbow could respond, and Harmony walked in from her afternoon shopping expedition. She moved with the fluid grace of someone who spent significant time and money perfecting her physical form. Her designer yoga outfit coordinated perfectly with her designer handbag and designer coffee cup. Everything about her was curated, optimized, invested in. "Oh, good, you're both here," she said, setting down her purchases on the counter next to my groceries. "Rainbow, I wanted to discuss adding another session this week. I had the most amazing breakthrough yesterday, and I really want to build on that momentum." Another session, another $250, another increment in the running total I'd been keeping in my head, a number that had grown so large it had moved beyond frustrating into the realm of genuinely disturbing. But what disturbed me more than the money was the casualness of it, the assumption that the funds would simply appear as they always had. "That sounds wonderful," Rainbow said, pulling out her phone to check her schedule. "I have an opening Thursday afternoon. Same rate as usual." Same rate as usual. As if Harmony were the one paying it, as if the money materialized from her newfound spiritual abundance rather than from my carefully managed retirement accounts.
I watched this exchange with the detached fascination of an anthropologist studying a particularly interesting cultural ritual. The casual entitlement, the complete lack of awareness about where the money actually came from, the way both women simply assumed that Harmony's spiritual journey was worth whatever it cost, regardless of who bore the actual financial burden. "Mom Linda," Harmony said, finally acknowledging my presence with that particular combination of warmth and distance she'd perfected. "Thanks for picking up the groceries. Did you remember this special honey?" The special honey? $68 for a jar of honey that would be consumed in a week? Justified because it was harvested from bees that lived in some remote mountain region where the flowers grew in particularly pure soil? I'd driven to 3 different specialty stores to find it, spending my afternoon in service of Harmony's increasingly elaborate dietary requirements. "It's in the bag by the window," I said. "Perfect!" Rainbow was just telling me about this amazing workshop coming up next month, 3 days in Sedona with a master teacher who only takes 12 students at a time. It's exactly what I need to take my practice to the next level. Sedona. I knew what that meant without having to ask. Flights, hotels, workshop fees, meals at the kind of restaurants that catered to spiritual tourists with unlimited budgets. Probably $5,000 minimum, maybe more, depending on how elaborate Harmony's definition of necessary had become. "That sounds transformative," I said, keeping my voice carefully neutral while my mind began calculating how much of my retirement fund had already been transformed into my daughter-in-law's enlightenment. Rainbow nodded enthusiastically. "It really is life-changing. I studied with the same teacher 2 years ago, and it completely shifted my understanding of energy work. The investment is significant, but you can't put a price on spiritual growth." You can't put a price on spiritual growth, except apparently you could, and apparently that price was always higher than the last one, always more elaborate, always more essential for the next breakthrough that would finally complete Harmony's transformation into whatever idealized version of herself she was chasing. I excused myself and walked to the bathroom, needing a moment to collect my thoughts away from the casual discussion of my money being spent on things I'd never been consulted about. Standing in front of the mirror, I studied my reflection and tried to remember when I'd become this person, the silent financier of other people's dreams. My face looked older than I remembered, lined with the particular weariness that comes from years of swallowing your own needs in service of family peace. When had I started prioritizing harmony over honesty? When had I decided that my role in this family was to provide financial support while remaining emotionally invisible? The woman looking back at me from the mirror was a stranger in some ways, someone who'd allowed herself to become a supporting character in her own life story. But underneath the careful politeness and practiced restraint, I could see something else. A spark of the person I'd been before I'd learned to make myself small enough to fit into other people's expectations. I'd built a successful business from nothing, raised 2 children largely on my own after my husband died young, put myself through night school to get my accounting degree while working full-time during the day. I'd survived cancer, buried my parents, weathered financial crises that would have broken lesser people. I was not a woman who lacked spiritual awareness or personal strength. What I lacked was the luxury of treating life like a spiritual shopping mall where enlightenment could be purchased from the highest bidder. What I lacked was the privilege of assuming someone else would always pay for my growth, my breakthroughs, my journey toward my best self. When I returned to the kitchen, Harmony and Rainbow were deep in conversation about energy meridians and the importance of releasing generational trauma. They looked up as I entered, their expressions showing mild annoyance at having their important discussion interrupted by my presence. "Actually," I said, addressing Rainbow directly, "I've been thinking about your question, about why I never join your yoga sessions." Both women turned to face me fully, curiosity replacing annoyance. I had their attention now, perhaps for the first time since Rainbow had started coming to the house. "The truth is," I continued, "I've been too busy paying for enlightenment to have time to experience it myself." The silence that followed was thick with confusion. Rainbow's brow furrowed as she tried to process what I had said, while Harmony's expression shifted towards something that might have been irritation. "I don't understand," she said slowly. "I think you do," I replied. "You asked why I never join your sessions with Harmony."
The answer is simple. I can't afford to pay for yoga lessons and take them at the same time. Not when each session costs $250, and not when I'm the one writing the checks. The color drained from Rainbow's face as the implication hit her. She glanced between me and Harmony, clearly trying to navigate this unexpected revelation. "I didn't realize that you were paying for everything," I finished. "No, I don't suppose you would have known that. It's not something we generally advertise." Harmony's face had gone pale as well, but for different reasons. "Mom, Linda, that's not really something we need to discuss in front of Rainbow." "Isn't it?" I asked. "She seems very concerned about my spiritual wellness. I thought she might want to understand the full context of the situation she's commenting on." Rainbow mumbled something about needing to check her schedule and excused herself, gathering her things with the hasty efficiency of someone who'd suddenly realized she was in the middle of a family drama she wanted no part of. She left through the front door without another word about my spiritual deficiencies or the importance of joining family yoga sessions. Harmony and I stood alone in the kitchen, the organic groceries arranged between us like expensive peace offerings. The silence stretched until it became uncomfortable, then moved past uncomfortable into something approaching hostile. "That was embarrassing," Harmony said finally. "Rainbow didn't need to know our personal business." "Our personal business?" I repeated. "Is that what you call it when I pay for your yoga instructor while she lectures me about my lack of spiritual development?" "You offered to help us financially. We never asked you to do that." The words hit me like a physical blow, so perfectly crafted to shift responsibility that I almost admired their efficiency. "You offered. We never asked." As if the careful hints, the strategic mentions of missed opportunities, the subtle guilt trips about their financial constraints hadn't been carefully orchestrated requests for help. "You're right," I said. "You never asked directly. You're far too sophisticated for anything that crude." "What's that supposed to mean?" I pulled out one of the kitchen chairs and sat down, suddenly feeling every one of my 68 years. "It means I'm tired, Harmony. I'm tired of pretending that your spiritual journey is somehow separate from my financial sacrifice. I'm tired of being treated like an ATM that happens to be related to your husband. And I'm especially tired of being lectured about my spiritual deficiencies by someone I'm essentially employing." Harmony's mouth opened and closed several times before she found her voice. "That's not fair. My spiritual growth benefits everyone in this family. When I'm centered and balanced, it creates positive energy for all of us." "Does it?" I asked. "Because from where I'm sitting, your centered and balanced energy feels remarkably similar to expensive self-absorption." The words hung in the air between us like a challenge thrown down. I'd finally said what I'd been thinking for years, finally given voice to the resentment that had been building like pressure in a kettle. There was no taking it back now, no retreating into the careful neutrality that had preserved family peace at the cost of my own integrity. Harmony's face cycled through several emotions before settling on something that looked like righteous indignation. "I can't believe you would say something like that. After everything I've been through, after all the work I've done to heal myself and become a better person. What exactly have you been through?" The question came out sharper than I'd intended, but I didn't apologize for it. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been through a series of expensive workshops and retreats, all funded by someone else's retirement money. You don't understand the trauma I've had to overcome, the generational patterns I've had to break, the inner work that— Stop. I held at my hand, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice. Just stop. I know
about trauma, Harmony.
I know about hard work and overcoming obstacles and breaking patterns. What I don't know about is packaging personal growth into a luxury experience that someone else pays for. She stared at me as if I had suddenly started speaking a foreign language. Perhaps I had. Perhaps the language of direct honesty was foreign in a relationship that had been built on careful indirection and mutual pretense. I think you need to take some time to think about what you've said, she told me, her voice taking on the tone of a disappointed teacher addressing a particularly slow student. When you're ready to approach this conversation from a place of love and understanding. Oh, I'm approaching it from a place of understanding, I interrupted. I understand that I've been an enabler. I understand that I've been so afraid of conflict that I've allowed myself to become a silent partner in my own disrespect. And I understand that this stops now. The front door opened before Harmony could respond, and David walked in from work. He took one look at our faces and stopped in his tracks, his expression shifting from casual greeting to wariness. "What's going on?" he asked, setting down his briefcase and looking between his wife and his mother with the careful neutrality of someone who learned to navigate family tensions. "Your mother," Harmony began, her voice taking on the trembling quality of someone who'd been deeply wronged, "has been saying some very hurtful things about my spiritual practice." David's gaze shifted to me, and I saw something in his eyes that made my chest tighten. Not surprise at his wife's complaint, but resignation, as if he'd been expecting this conversation for a long time and dreading its arrival. "What kind of things?" he asked quietly. I looked at my son, this man I'd raised to be honest and principled, and realized that somewhere along the way he'd learned to choose the easy path over the right one. He knew exactly what his wife was doing with my money. He knew exactly how the system worked, how the hints were dropped and the guilt applied and the funds transferred. He'd been a willing participant in the elaborate dance that had kept me writing checks while being treated like an inconvenience. I told Rainbow that I don't join the yoga sessions because I'm too busy paying for them. I told your wife that I'm tired of funding Enlightenment I'm not allowed to participate in. David winced as if I'd struck him. "Mom, you know we appreciate everything you do for us. Harmony's never said you couldn't participate." "Hasn't she?" I asked. "When exactly was I invited to join these sessions, David? When was I asked what I thought about the constant workshops and retreats and expensive teachers? When was my opinion solicited about how my money should be spent on your wife's spiritual journey?" He had no answer for that, and his silence was more damning than any argument could have been. I watched my son realize that his mother had been quietly documenting years of small exclusions and casual dismissals, that the careful system they'd built to access my generosity had come at the cost of treating me like a human being. "We just thought you weren't interested in that kind of thing," Harmony said, her voice smaller now. "You always seemed so practical, so focused on business and money." "I am focused on money," I agreed, "particularly when it's my money being spent without my input or acknowledgement. And I am practical, which is why I've started asking some very practical questions about this arrangement." David sat down across from me, and for a moment he looked like the little boy he'd once been, caught in a lie he couldn't explain away. "What kind of questions?" I reached into my purse and pulled out a manila folder I'd been carrying around for weeks, waiting for the right moment to open it. Inside were bank statements, credit card receipts, copies of checks, and a detailed spreadsheet I'd created to track exactly how much money had been spent on Harmony's spiritual development over the past 3 years. Questions like, why I've transferred $67,000 to your account in the past 18 months, I said, opening the folder and spreading the documents on the table. Questions like why that money seems to disappear into workshops and retreats and private sessions without any discussion about whether it's money we can afford to spend. The number hung in the air like an accusation. $67,000. More than many people made in a year, spent on what amounted to expensive therapy disguised as spiritual practice.
Harmony gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as if the number had physically struck her. It can't be that much. It's actually more, I said, pointing to the spreadsheet. This doesn't include the groceries, the supplements, the books, the meditation cushions, the crystals, the essential oils, and all the other accessories required for proper enlightenment. If we include those, we're looking at closer to $80,000. David stared at the papers with the expression of a man watching his life crumble in real time. I didn't realize it had added up to so much. Of course you didn't, because it was never your money to begin with. It's easy to lose track of spending when someone else is footing the bill.
The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the sound of Harmony crying softly into her hands. I felt no satisfaction in her tears, no victory in David's obvious shame. This wasn't about winning or losing. This was about finally speaking truth after years of polite fiction. "I don't know what you want us to say," David said finally. "We can't give the money back. The workshops are already paid for. The session's already completed." "I don't want the money back," I said. "Money spent is money spent. What I want is something much more valuable and much more difficult to give." They both looked at me with identical expressions of confusion and hope, as if there might be some easy answer that would restore the comfortable arrangement we'd all pretended was working. "I want honesty," I said. "I want to be treated like a person whose opinion matters, whose presence is valued for more than just what I can contribute financially. I want to be included in decisions about how my money is spent, and I want acknowledgement that my generosity comes with a cost." Harmony looked up from her hands, her face streaked with tears and mascara. "I never meant to make you feel excluded." "But you did exclude me," I said gently. "Every time you made plans without consulting me. Every time you introduced me as David's mother instead of by name. Every time you treated my financial support as an entitlement rather than a gift. Every time you allowed someone like Rainbow to lecture me about my spiritual deficiencies while I was literally paying her salary." David reached across the table and took my hand, his touch tentative, as if you weren't sure he still had the right to casual affection. "What can we do to fix this?" It was the right question, asked too late, but with genuine remorse. I looked at my son and saw the man I'd raised, buried under years of taking the easy path and avoiding difficult conversations. I saw someone who'd allowed his marriage to become more important than his integrity, who'd chosen temporary peace over lasting honesty. "You can start by acknowledging what's actually been happening here," I said. "Not the story you've been telling yourselves about grateful appreciation and spiritual necessity, but the reality of how this has actually worked." They exchanged glances, and I could see them trying to decide how much truth this moment required. I waited, letting the silence work on them, letting the weight of 3 years of accumulated dishonesty press down on the kitchen table between us. "We've been taking advantage of your generosity," David said finally, the words coming out slowly as if they physically hurt to say. "We've been treating your support like it was our right instead of your choice." It wasn't a complete confession, but it was a start. I could see Harmony struggling with the admission, her face cycling through denial and anger before settling on something that might have been shame. "And," I prompted, "and we've been excluding you from decisions that affect you directly," Harmony added reluctantly. "We've been making assumptions about what you wanted instead of asking." "And," David swallowed hard, "and we've been dishonest about how much we've been asking for and what we've been spending it on." I nodded slowly. "That's closer to the truth. Not the whole truth, but closer." The whole truth was uglier and more complicated than either of them was ready to acknowledge. The whole truth included the way they'd learned to manipulate my guilt about having money while they struggled, the way they'd positioned my financial support as a form of family bonding rather than what it actually was. The whole truth included the gradual erosion of my boundaries and the systematic dismissal of my needs in favor of Harmony's endless quest for transformation. But partial truth was still progress. Partial acknowledgement was still better than the complete denial we'd been operating under for years. "So what happens now?" Harmony asked, her voice small and uncertain.
I looked around the kitchen, at the expensive groceries I'd purchased, at the comfortable home I'd helped them afford, at the life they'd built on the foundation of my unacknowledged sacrifice. 3 years of careful enabling had created a situation that couldn't be easily untangled, but it could be changed. Now we figure out what this family looks like when it's built on honesty instead of convenient fiction, I said. Now we learn how to have relationships that don't depend on my silence and your entitlement. It wasn't going to be easy. Changing established patterns never was, especially when those patterns had been carefully constructed to avoid exactly this kind of difficult conversation. But for the first time in 3 years, I felt like myself again. Not the polite, accommodating version of myself I'd created to keep family peace, but the real version. The version who'd built a business and raised children and survived everything life had thrown at her. The version who was too busy living her own life to pay for someone else's enlightenment without getting a little respect in return. The afternoon sun was slanting through the kitchen windows, casting long shadows across the table where the evidence of our family's careful dishonesty lay spread like cards in a game nobody wanted to finish playing. I gathered up the bank statements and receipts, slipping them back into the manila folder with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd spent 40 years managing other people's financial messes. David and Harmony sat in silence, still processing the conversation that had just rearranged the foundation of our relationship. They looked shell-shocked, as if they'd been expecting a gentle family discussion and instead found themselves in the middle of an earthquake. I stood up, smoothing down my skirt and checking my watch. "I should be going," I said. "I have a meeting with my financial advisor this afternoon." "What kind of meeting?" David asked, his voice careful. "The kind where we discuss how to restructure my retirement accounts so that future generosity comes with clear boundaries and explicit agreements. The kind where we talk about the difference between family support and enablement."
"You're cutting us off?" The question was loaded with panic, and I realized how much my financial support had become woven into their sense of security. They weren't just worried about losing money, they were worried about losing their lifestyle, their ability to pursue expensive solutions to life's challenges. "I'm not cutting you off," I said. "I'm changing the terms of engagement. From now on, any financial support comes with full disclosure, mutual agreement, and clear expectations about what I'm contributing to and why." "That sounds reasonable," David said, though his expression suggested he was still calculating what this might mean for their carefully constructed life. "It does, doesn't it?" I agreed. "I'm surprised it took us 3 years to get to reasonable." I picked up my purse and headed toward the front door, then stopped and turned back to face them. There was something else that needed to be said, something that had been festering in my chest for months. "You know what the saddest part of all this is?" I asked. "It's not the money. Money is just money. The saddest part is that you never once asked me what I might need, what I might want, what my own spiritual journey might look like." Harmony's eyes filled with fresh tears. "I never thought—" "No," I agreed. "You never did think about that. You assumed that my role in this family was to provide support, not to receive it. You assumed that my needs were somehow less important than yours, that my growth was somehow less valuable than your enlightenment." David stood up as if to follow me, then seemed to think better of it. "Mom, Don't," I said gently. "Don't try to fix this with words. Fix it with actions. Show me that you understand what's been happening here, and show me what our relationship looks like when it's based on mutual respect instead of convenient assumptions." I left them sitting in their kitchen with their expensive groceries and their uncomfortable truths, driving away from their house with a lightness in my chest I hadn't felt in years. The conversation had been difficult but necessary. Like surgery, it had hurt in the moment, but removed something toxic that had been slowly poisoning our family dynamic. My financial advisor's office was downtown, in one of those glass towers that reach toward the sky like monuments to economic ambition. I'd been meeting with Janet Morrison for 15 years, ever since she'd helped me reorganize my finances after my husband's death. She was the kind of practical, no-nonsense woman who understood that money was a tool, not a scoreboard, and she had helped me build the kind of security that allowed for generosity without foolishness.
"Linda," she said, standing up from her desk as I was ushered into her office. "You sounded serious on the phone. Everything all right?" I settled into the leather chair across from her desk and pulled out the manila folder. "I need to talk about family money," I said. "Specifically, about how to love people without enabling them." Janet had heard enough family financial stories over the years that nothing surprised her anymore. She listened without judgment as I walked through the bank statements and spreadsheets, explaining how 3 years of good intentions had created a system that was unsustainable for me and unhealthy for my son and daughter-in-law. 80,000 in 3 years, she said when I finished, her tone carefully neutral. "That's significant money, Linda. How has this affected your overall financial position?" We spent the next hour reviewing my retirement accounts, my investment portfolio, my long-term care insurance, and all the other financial structures that would determine my security for the rest of my life. The numbers were still solid, my position still secure, but the drain of supporting Harmony's spiritual journey had been more significant than I'd realized. "The good news is that you can afford what you've been spending," Janet said, finally. "The concerning news is that you've been spending it without any clear structure or limits. If this pattern continues, it could impact your long-term security." "It's not continuing," I said firmly. "That's why I'm here." We worked together to establish what she called family support guidelines, clear annual limits on financial assistance, explicit agreements about what expenses would and wouldn't be covered, and regular reviews to ensure that support was achieving its intended purpose rather than simply enabling dependency. "What you've been doing is classic enablement," Janet explained as we finished setting up the new structure. "You've been protecting them from the natural consequences of their choices, which means they've never had to develop their own financial discipline or realistic expectations about what they can afford." "I know," I said. "I just wanted to help." "And help can be valuable," she agreed, "but help that comes without boundaries or accountability often does more harm than good in the long run."
Driving home from Janet's office, I felt the strange combination of relief and sadness that comes with finally addressing a problem you've been avoiding for too long. The relief came from having a clear plan, a way forward that would allow me to maintain my generosity while protecting my integrity. The sadness came from recognizing how much damage had been done to my relationships in the name of keeping the peace. My phone rang as I was pulling into my driveway, David's name appearing on the dashboard display.
I considered letting it go to voicemail, then decided that avoiding difficult conversations was what had gotten us into this mess in the first place. "Hi, sweetheart," I said, accepting the call. "Mom, I've been thinking about what you said today." His voice was heavy with something that might have been regret. "I think I owe you an apology." "You think?" "I know," he corrected. "I know I owe you an apology. We both do. What we've been doing isn't fair to you, and it isn't healthy for us either." I parked in my garage and sat in the silence for a moment before responding. "What exactly are you apologizing for, David?" It was important that he name it, that he understands specifically what had gone wrong, rather than offering a generic apology that would leave the underlying problems unaddressed. "I'm apologizing for taking advantage of your generosity," he said slowly, "for letting Harmony and me build a lifestyle we couldn't afford on our own, and then acting like your support was something we deserved rather than something we should be grateful for. And for not standing up for you when you were being treated disrespectfully in your own family, for choosing the easy path instead of the right one. It wasn't everything, but it was enough to start rebuilding from." I could hear genuine remorse in his voice, the sound of someone who'd finally looked in the mirror and recognized what he'd become. "Thank you," I said. "That means more to me than you know." "What happens now?" he asked, echoing his wife's earlier question. "Now we figure out how to have a relationship built on honesty and mutual respect," I said. "It won't be easy, and it won't happen overnight, but it's possible if we're both committed to it." "I am committed," he said. "I want to make this right." "Then we'll figure it out together," I promised, one honest conversation at a time.
The week that followed our kitchen confrontation passed in a strange, suspended animation, as if our entire family was holding its breath, waiting to see what shape our new reality would take. David called twice, both conversations careful and stilted, like we were strangers trying to find common ground. Harmony sent a text message thanking me for the groceries and apologizing for any misunderstanding, as if 3 years of financial exploitation could be dismissed as a simple miscommunication. I spent those days in my own house, rediscovering what it felt like to live without the constant low-level anxiety of wondering what the next spiritual emergency would cost me. My home felt different somehow, more peaceful, as if speaking the truth had cleared some invisible smog that had been clouding the air for years. On Thursday afternoon, I was working in my garden when I noticed a car pulling into my driveway. Not David's familiar sedan, but a small white Honda that looked like it had seen better decades. I watched through my kitchen window as a young woman got out, looking uncertain and slightly overwhelmed by the size of my house. She was perhaps 25, with the kind of natural beauty that didn't require expensive maintenance. Her clothes were clean, but clearly secondhand, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She stood by her car for a moment, checking something on her phone, before walking toward my front door with the determined stride of someone who had rehearsed this moment many times. The doorbell rang twice before I answered, and when I opened the door, I found myself looking into eyes that were startlingly familiar. Not in their color or shape, but in their expression. The same mixture of pride and desperation I'd seen in my own reflection during the hardest years of building my business. "Mrs. Chen?" she asked, her voice carrying a slight accent I couldn't immediately place. "I'm Maria Santos. I teach at the community center downtown. I was wondering if I could speak with you for a few minutes." Community center. The phrase triggered a memory from several months ago, a conversation with David about some volunteer work Harmony had mentioned wanting to do. Something about teaching yoga to underserved populations, bringing mindfulness to people who couldn't afford private instruction. I'd assumed it was another expensive certification program disguised as altruism. "Of course," I said, stepping back to let her in. "Would you like some coffee?" She followed me to the kitchen, her eyes taking in the expensive appliances and marble countertops with the careful neutrality of someone who'd learned not to let her circumstances show on her face. I poured 2 cups of coffee and gestured for her to sit at the breakfast table. "I'm not sure if you know about me," she began, wrapping her hands around the warm mug as if drawing comfort from it. "Your daughter-in-law mentioned that she might be able to help with our program." "What kind of program?" I asked, though I was beginning to suspect I knew where this conversation was headed. "Free yoga classes for single mothers," Maria explained. "We meet twice a week at the community center. Most of our participants are working multiple jobs, dealing with incredible stress, trying to raise children on their own. The classes aren't about fancy poses or expensive equipment. They're about giving these women an hour to breathe."
I studied her face as she spoke, noting the way her voice grew stronger when she talked about her work. This wasn't someone chasing enlightenment as a lifestyle choice. This was someone who understood that stress was a luxury problem for people with enough resources to address it systematically. "Harmony said she might be able to volunteer?" I asked. Maria's expression grew carefully diplomatic. "She seemed very interested when we first talked. She has impressive credentials, lots of training with well-known teachers. But when I tried to follow up about scheduling, she said there might be some complications with her availability." Complications with her availability. I could translate that easily enough. Harmony had probably realized that volunteer work at a community center wouldn't advance her spiritual resume or provide access to wealthy students who might pay for private sessions. "What kind of complications?" I asked. "She mentioned something about needing to focus on her advanced training with a teacher in Sedona," Maria said carefully. "She said it was important for her development as an instructor." Sedona. The $5,000 workshop that was supposed to take Harmony's practice to the next level. The advanced training that was more important than helping women who were struggling to keep their heads above water. "I see," I said.
And you came here because... Maria looked uncomfortable, as if she were violating some social protocol by being direct. Because she mentioned that her family was very supportive of her spiritual practice, I thought maybe there might be other ways to help our program, even if she can't volunteer directly. Family support. Another euphemism for my financial contributions, carefully repackaged to make them sound like collective family values rather than individual sacrifice. Tell me more about your program, I said. How many women participate? What do you need that you don't have? For the next hour, Maria painted a picture of her work that was both heartbreaking and inspiring. 23 women currently in the program, ages ranging from 19 to 45. Some were divorced, some had never married, all were raising children with minimal support systems. They worked as housekeepers, store clerks, restaurant servers, home health aides, jobs that paid just enough to survive but never enough to thrive. The yoga classes were held in a multi-purpose room at the community center, using donated mats that were cracked with age. No mirrors, no special lighting, no expensive props. Just women gathering twice a week to stretch their bodies and quiet their minds in the brief spaces between work shifts and parenting duties. The hardest part, Maria explained, is that so many of them feel guilty for taking even that hour for themselves. They're so used to putting everyone else's needs first that the idea of self-care feels selfish. Self-care. The same concept that had justified $80,000 in spiritual shopping for Harmony, except applied to women who felt guilty for spending an hour on themselves twice a week. What would help the program most? I asked. Honestly, better space. The community center is wonderful, but we share the room with other programs. Sometimes we get bumped for events, or we have to set up around folding chairs from the seniors meeting. And transportation is always an issue. Some of the women take 2 buses to get to class. I found myself thinking about the home studio that Harmony had wanted me to build in David's house. A dedicated space with professional-grade equipment, mirrors, sound system, specialized flooring. $15,000 for a room that would serve one person's advanced practice. Have you looked into renting dedicated space? I asked. Maria laughed, but not with humor. On our budget, we can barely afford the materials we need. Most of these women are paying for classes with spare change, literally. We charge $5 per session, and even that's too much for some of them. $5 per session versus $250 for Harmony's private instruction. The mathematics of privilege and need laid out in stark contrast. Would you mind if I came to observe one of your classes? I asked. I'd like to see what you're doing. Maria's face lit up with surprise and hope. You'd be welcome any time. We meet Tuesday and Thursday evenings at 6, but I should warn you, it's nothing like what you might be used to. Nothing like what I might be used to.
She assumed I was familiar with expensive yoga studios, with the kind of pristine environments where spiritual practice came with luxury amenities. She had no way of knowing that my spiritual practice consisted mostly of working in my garden and reading philosophy books I'd collected over 40 years of trying to make sense of life's challenges. I think I can handle it, I said with a smile. After Maria left, I sat in my kitchen with her business card, a simple piece of cardstock with the community center's address handwritten in careful script. No embossed logos, no spiritual quotes, no promises of transformation. Just basic information about where to find women who were doing the real work of spiritual practice without calling it that. That evening, I called David to tell him about my visitor. "Maria Santos," he said when I mentioned her name. "Oh, right, the community center thing. Harmony was excited about that for a while, but I think it conflicted with her training schedule." Training schedule. As if learning to help struggling mothers was somehow less valuable than attending workshops for people who already had every advantage in life. "Did you know that she charges $5 per class?" I asked. "Who, Maria? That's nice of her to keep it affordable."
Nice of her. As if Maria were running a charity hobby rather than trying to serve a population that had been systematically excluded from wellness services because they couldn't afford them. David, I said carefully, do you think there's something wrong with a system where your wife spends more on a single private yoga session than some women make in a week? The silence that followed was long enough for me to imagine him working through the implications of that question. When he finally spoke, his voice was smaller than before. I never thought about it that way. No, I agreed. I don't think any of us did. Tuesday evening found me driving through a part of town I rarely visited, past strip malls and discount stores and apartment complexes that housed the people who cleaned offices and stocked shelves and kept the city running while remaining largely invisible to those who benefited from their labor. The community center was a low brick building that had clearly been built in the 1970s and maintained on a shoestring budget ever since. The parking lot was cracked and poorly lit, marked with spaces for a dozen cars. I counted 8 vehicles, all older models showing signs of careful maintenance by owners who couldn't afford to replace them. Inside, the building smelled like industrial cleaner and coffee, with bulletin boards covered in flyers for GED classes, job training programs, and childcare services. The multi-purpose room Maria had described was at the end of a hallway lined with children's artwork and motivational posters about perseverance. I paused in the doorway, taking in the scene before me. 15 women were arranged on worn yoga mats in a space that was clearly designed for other purposes. Folding chairs were stacked against one wall, and I could see where they'd pushed tables to the perimeter to make room for the class. The women themselves were a study in diversity and resilience. Young mothers with tired eyes, older women whose bodies showed the wear of decades of physical labor, teenagers who looked like they were barely managing to hold their lives together. They wore whatever clothes they had that allowed for movement, mostly t-shirts and sweatpants, nothing matching or coordinated. Maria stood at the front of the room, her voice gentle but clear, as she guided them through a series of poses that emphasized release and restoration rather than achievement or perfection. There were no mirrors, no adjustments, no spiritual lectures about finding your authentic self, just practical instruction in the art of letting your body relax after another day of carrying more than it should have to carry. Now just breathe, Maria was saying as I quietly found a spot along the wall. You don't have to make the breath perfect or special. Just notice that you're breathing and let that be enough. Let that be enough. The phrase hit me with unexpected force. When was the last time I'd heard someone suggest that simple presence could be sufficient? That spiritual practice didn't require constant improvement or expensive enhancement. I watched these women follow Maria's instructions with a focus that came from genuine need rather than lifestyle choice. They weren't here to align their chakras or achieve enlightenment. They were here because their bodies hurt, and their minds were overwhelmed, and they'd carved out 2 hours in their impossible schedules to remember that they were human beings deserving of care. The contrast with Harmony's approach to yoga was stark and illuminating. Where Harmony had learned to see spiritual practice as a form of self-optimization, requiring constant upgrading and refinement, these women understood it as basic maintenance. Where Harmony spoke of transformation and breakthrough, they were grateful simply for the opportunity to stretch muscles that had been tense for days. After the class ended, several of the women approached me, curious about the well-dressed stranger who'd been observing their practice. Their questions were polite but direct, tinged with the wariness of people who'd learned that outsiders usually wanted something from them. "Are you thinking about joining?" asked a woman who introduced herself as Carmen. She looked to be in her 40s with calloused hands and the kind of practical haircut that required minimal maintenance. "Maria's really good. She doesn't make you feel bad if you can't do the fancy poses." "I was just curious about the program. I'm impressed by what you've built here." "Maria built it. We just show up. Some weeks that's about all we can manage. Just showing up." Just showing up. Another phrase that resonated with unexpected power. When had simple consistency become such a radical act? When had the basic commitment to care for yourself become something to apologize for? I stayed after the other women left, helping Maria roll up mats and stack chairs.
The work was companionable, requiring no conversation, giving me time to process what I'd witnessed. "What did you think?" Maria asked finally,
as we finished returning the room to its multi-purpose configuration. "I think you're doing something extraordinary here," I said honestly. "And I think you're doing it under conditions that make it much harder than it should be." She smiled, but tiredly. "Most good work happens under difficult conditions. If we waited for perfect circumstances, nothing would ever get done." We walked to the parking lot together, the evening air still warm with the day's heat. The streetlights cast long shadows across the cracked asphalt, and I could hear traffic from the nearby highway, the constant hum of a city that never quite slept. "Maria," I said as we reached our cars, "what would this program look like if money weren't a constraint?" She paused with her hand on her car door, considering the question seriously. "Dedicated space," she said finally, "reliable schedule, better mats, maybe some props for people with injuries, transportation assistance for women who can't get here consistently, childcare during classes. What else? A second instructor so we could offer more sessions, maybe some workshops on other wellness topics, basic nutrition, stress management, simple meditation techniques." She paused. "But honestly, Mrs. Chen, I've learned not to dream too big. It makes the disappointment easier to handle." I understood that philosophy, the protective pragmatism of someone who'd been let down too many times to risk hoping for dramatic change. But standing in that parking lot, surrounded by the evidence of what could be accomplished with minimal resources and maximum commitment, I found myself thinking about different kinds of spiritual practice. "What if I told you that money doesn't have to be a constraint?" I asked. Maria stared at me for a long moment, as if trying to decode a message in a foreign language. "I'm not sure what you mean." "I mean, what if you could have the dedicated space, the reliable schedule, the better equipment? What if you could expand the program to serve more women, offer more services?" "Mrs. Chen," she said carefully, "I appreciate the thought, but programs like this don't usually attract that kind of funding. We're not a sexy cause. We don't have marketing materials or donor events or tax incentive structures." "Maybe that's exactly why you should attract funding," I said. "Maybe the lack of marketing materials is a feature, not a bug." I handed her my business card, a simple piece of cardstock with my name and phone number. "I'd like to discuss some possibilities with you. Are you free for lunch this week?" She took the card with hands that were slightly trembling, as if she were afraid to believe what was happening. "Mrs. Chen, I don't want to assume anything, but if you're thinking about making some kind of donation..." "I'm thinking about making an investment," I corrected, "in something that actually works, that actually serves people who need it, that actually understands what spiritual practice looks like when it's not a luxury service." Driving home through the quiet streets of my neighborhood, I found myself thinking about the different kinds of transformation I'd witnessed that evening. The women in Maria's class weren't seeking to become different people through expensive interventions. They were seeking to become more themselves through simple, consistent attention to their basic needs. There had been no talk of breakthrough or enlightenment, no promise of dramatic change or spiritual advancement, just an hour of gentle movement and conscious breathing. Just the radical act of treating their bodies with kindness after days of treating them as machines for productivity. It was a kind of spiritual practice that Harmony, for all her expensive training and advanced certifications, had never encountered, not because she lacked access to it, but because she'd been taught to look for spirituality in places that required significant financial investment rather than simple, daily commitment to presence and self-care. My phone rang as I was pulling into my garage, David's name appearing on the dashboard display. I considered letting it go to voicemail, then decided that avoidance had caused enough problems in our family already. "Hi, sweetheart," I said, accepting the call. "Mom, I wanted to talk to you about something." His voice had that careful quality it had taken on since our kitchen confrontation, as if he were walking through a minefield of potential misunderstandings. "What's on your mind?" "Harmony's been doing some thinking about what you said, about being included in decisions, about having your input on how your money gets spent." I waited, letting him work through whatever he was trying to say without rushing to make it easier for him. "She wants to cancel the Sedona workshop. She wants to use that money for something else, something that includes you." "Something that includes you?" The phrase was clearly Harmony's, probably crafted during hours of discussion about how to repair our relationship without fundamentally changing the dynamic that had caused the problem in the first place. What did she have in mind?
I asked. She thought maybe you could go together to a mother-daughter wellness retreat. Or maybe she could pay for both of you to work with a spiritual counselor who specializes in family relationships. Both suggestions were classic harmony solutions, expensive experiences designed to address relationship problems without examining the underlying patterns that had created them. The retreat would cost as much as the Sedona workshop, and the spiritual counselor would probably charge premium rates for the privilege of telling us that we needed to communicate better. "That's thoughtful of her," I said carefully, "but I think I have a different idea." I told him about Maria's program, about the community center, about the women who were practicing authentic spirituality without expensive accessories or professional guidance. I described the dedicated space they needed, the equipment that would make their practice more accessible, the transportation and childcare that would allow more women to participate. "You want us to donate to a yoga program?" David asked, confusion clear in his voice. "I want us to invest in something real," I corrected. "Something that actually helps people instead of just making privileged people feel better about themselves." The silence that followed was long enough for me to imagine the conversation he'd be having with Harmony after we hung up. The careful negotiation between her desire to maintain her spiritual shopping lifestyle and her need to repair our relationship. "How much would something like that cost?" he asked finally. "Probably about the same as the Sedona workshop," I said. "Maybe a little more if we want to do it right." "And you think this would be better than us spending time together?" The question revealed so much about how he'd been taught to think about relationships and money, as if the only way for families to connect was through shared consumption experiences, as if the highest form of togetherness was paying professionals to facilitate our interactions. "David," I said gently, "spending money together isn't the same thing as spending time together. And spending money on other people isn't the same thing as avoiding the hard work of honest relationships." I could hear him breathing on the other end of the line, processing concepts that challenged everything he'd learned about how love and money intersected in family systems. "What would you want from us?" he asked. "If we did this, if we supported this program, what would that look like?" It was the right question, finally. Not how much it would cost or what he would get in return, but what authentic participation would require from all of us. "I'd want us to volunteer," I said. "Not write a check and walk away, but actually show up and help. I'd want Harmony to teach some classes, to share her skills with women who can't afford private instruction. I'd want you to help with practical things, setup and cleanup and administrative tasks. And you? I'd want to learn what spiritual practice looks like when it's not about self-improvement, but about service, when it's not about becoming a better version of yourself, but about showing up for other people, exactly as you are." After I hung up, I sat in my car for a few more minutes, thinking about the different kinds of transformation that money could buy. Harmony's approach had been about purchasing access to experiences that would change her from the outside in, surrounding herself with teachers and environments that would somehow shift her consciousness through proximity and participation. Maria's approach was about creating space for change that happened from the inside out, providing just enough support and structure for people to discover their own capacity for resilience and peace. It was slower, less dramatic, much less expensive, and infinitely more sustainable. The house felt different when I walked inside, charged with possibility in a way I hadn't experienced in years. For the first time since this whole situation began, I could see a path forward that didn't require anyone to be the villain or the victim, that didn't depend on guilt or resentment to motivate change. I made myself a cup of tea and sat down at my kitchen table with a legal pad, sketching out the beginnings of a plan. Not a plan to fix my family's relationship with money, but a plan to model what healthy relationships with money could look like. Not a plan to punish Harmony for her self-absorption, but a plan to give her the opportunity to discover what generosity felt like when it flowed outward instead of inward. By the time I went to bed that night, I had filled 3 pages with ideas about how to support Maria's program, how to expand its reach,
how to create the kind of sustainable funding that would allow it to serve more women without compromising its essential character. It felt like the kind of spiritual practice I'd been searching for without knowing it, the kind that emerged from paying attention to what was actually needed rather than what could be sold, the kind that measured success not in personal transformation but in collective well-being, the kind that understood that true enlightenment might have less to do with expensive teachers and workshops than with the simple daily choice to show up for other people with whatever resources you had available. For the first time in 3 years, I was excited about how my money might be spent, not because it would buy me anything, but because it would help create something larger than myself, something that would continue to serve long after I was gone. Something that would teach my family what it actually meant to practice generosity as a spiritual discipline rather than spiritual materialism as a family obligation. 3 months later, I stood in the renovated space that had once been a defunct auto repair shop, watching 28 women move through their practice in a room designed specifically for healing. The walls were painted in soft earth tones, with large windows that let in natural light during evening classes. Professional-grade mats were stacked neatly in custom cubbies, and a small childcare area in the corner allowed mothers to bring their children when other arrangements fell through. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. After my lunch with Maria, we'd spent weeks planning, researching, applying for permits, and coordinating with contractors who understood they were working on something more meaningful than a typical commercial renovation. David had surprised me by taking vacation days to help with the construction, arriving each morning in work clothes I hadn't seen him wear since college. Harmony's contribution had been more complex. She'd initially resisted the idea of teaching at the community center, citing concerns about insurance liability and her certification requirements. But something shifted during her first class with Maria's regular students. Maybe it was watching women grateful for basic instruction rather than advanced techniques. Maybe it was realizing that her expensive training had value when shared rather than hoarded. Now she taught 2 classes per week, her teaching style noticeably different from what I'd observed during her private sessions with Rainbow. Gone were the spiritual lectures and chakra assessments. Instead, she focused on practical modifications for bodies tired from physical labor, breathing techniques for managing anxiety, and simple stretches that could be done during work breaks.
Financial discussions happened openly rather than through hints and manipulation. Harmony presented monthly budgets that separated her personal wellness expenses from household necessities, acknowledging the difference between wants and needs. David had started attending the men's support group that met in the community center's other multipurpose room, discovering that other husbands struggled with similar issues around money, boundaries, and enabling behaviors in their marriages. He came home from those meetings quieter but more present, as if he'd finally found language for experiences he'd been carrying alone. The most unexpected change came from Maria herself. With dedicated space and reliable funding, she'd expanded beyond yoga into comprehensive wellness programming, nutrition workshops taught by volunteer nurses, financial literacy classes led by retired accountants, parenting support groups facilitated by licensed social workers. The space had become what she'd always envisioned but never dared to request, a true community wellness center. Standing there watching the evening class, I felt the particular satisfaction that comes from seeing resources used effectively rather than consumed conspicuously. The money I'd spent on this space would continue generating returns in the form of healthier, more resilient women who could better care for themselves and their families. My phone buzzed with a text from David. "Harmony and I want to take you to dinner tomorrow night. We have something to discuss." Something to discuss. A year ago, that phrase would have triggered anxiety about the next expensive workshop or retreat. Now I felt curiosity rather than dread, confident that our new communication patterns meant actual discussion rather than strategic manipulation. The class ended with 5 minutes of guided relaxation, women lying on their backs with eyes closed, some so deeply relaxed they appeared to be sleeping. Maria's voice was gentle but grounding, reminding them that they deserved this peace, that caring for themselves was not selfish but necessary.
As the women began rolling up their mats, several approached me with updates about their lives. Carmen had received a promotion at work after completing the financial literacy course. Jessica had started setting boundaries with her ex-husband after attending the parenting support group. Aisha was planning to apply for nursing school, inspired by the volunteer nurses who taught nutrition classes. These were the kinds of transformations that Harmony had been seeking through expensive teachers and workshops, but they were happening through community support and practical skill building rather than individual spiritual advancement. The women weren't becoming different people. They were becoming more fully themselves with better tools for handling life's challenges. After the center closed, Maria and I walked to our cars together, a routine we'd developed over the months. These brief conversations had become as valuable to me as the classes themselves, opportunities to understand how sustainable change actually happened in people's lives. "Mrs. Chen," she said as we reached the parking lot, "I wanted you to know that the board approved our application for nonprofit status. We'll be able to accept tax-deductible donations and apply for grants now." The transition to independent nonprofit status had been part of our long-term plan, ensuring that the center could continue operating without depending on my personal contributions. I'd served as the initial investor, but the goal had always been to create something sustainable that could outlive any individual donor. "That's wonderful news," I said. "You've built something really special here." "We've built something special," she corrected. "I couldn't have done this without your investment, but more than that, without your understanding of what we were trying to create." Driving home through familiar streets, I reflected on how different my life looked now compared to 6 months ago. The community center consumed far more of my time than writing checks for Harmony's spiritual shopping had ever required. But it felt like genuine engagement rather than passive enabling. My relationship with David and Harmony had stabilized into something more honest and sustainable. They still struggled financially, but they'd learned to distinguish between emergencies and inconveniences, between genuine needs and manufactured desires. Harmony continued her spiritual practice, but within boundaries that acknowledged the difference between self-care and self-indulgence. The dinner conversation the next evening revealed their latest discussion topic. They wanted to start a family savings account for future children, with contributions from all three of us according to our ability to pay. It was a mature approach to financial planning that acknowledged their desire for my involvement without creating dependence. We've been talking about what kind of parents we want to be, what kind of values we want to model for our children about money and generosity and service. It was perhaps the most thoughtful conversation we'd ever had about family values, grounded in their direct experience of seeing how money could be used to create community rather than purchase individual advancement. As I drove home that night, I realized that Rainbow's original question had been answered, though not in the way she'd intended. I hadn't joined Harmony's yoga sessions because I'd been too busy paying for Enlightenment to pursue it myself. But in the process of changing that dynamic, I discovered something more valuable than any workshop or retreat could ever provided. I'd learned that true spiritual practice wasn't about perfecting yourself through expensive interventions, but about showing up consistently for something larger than yourself. I'd learned that generosity was most meaningful when it created opportunities for others rather than experiences for yourself. I'd learned that family relationships were strongest when built on mutual respect rather than unacknowledged sacrifice. Most importantly, I'd learned that you don't need to purchase wisdom from expensive teachers when you're willing to learn from the people around you who are doing the real work of living with grace under pressure. The community center continued to thrive, serving more women each month, expanding its programming, training new volunteer instructors. It had become exactly what I'd hoped for when I first heard Maria describe her vision. A place where spiritual practice meant service, where wellness meant community, where growth meant helping others grow alongside you. Rainbow never returned to our family conversations about spiritual wellness. Perhaps she'd found other clients more suited to her particular brand of expensive enlightenment. I'd found something better. A family learning to practice generosity as a spiritual discipline rather than spiritual materialism as a lifestyle choice. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.